I read an article by Behruz translated by Munis in The Guardian, and that's when I reached out to him and we made contact, and I started translating his journalism, but after about 8 months, he told me about a contract that some advocates helped him get with a publisher, and he asked me if I could translate the literature, his book. And I was anxious about it because I wasn't sure whether I could make the shift from journalism to literature. It's quite difficult, and I'm not trained as a translator. It wasn't something that I'd done before on this level. But I accepted because I knew how important it was. Then Munis, she started emailing me the chapters that Behruz had written already. What happened was that he was sending Munis text messages of different lengths and instructing her on where to place them in terms of chapters. So by the time when I accepted the role of translator for the book, he'd written about 30% of the book, the early chapters, and Munis had compiled them into PDFs, and she emailed them to me. Once I started translating, and I was consulting with Behruz regularly, then he would start sending me text messages to add to it. And there was sometimes at the end, sometimes in between. There was some changes he wanted to make. So once I had the PDF, then there was a whole other range of or other level of changes or modifications that we needed to make. Then, while I was translating the early chapters, he was writing the middle chapters. And then while I was translating the middle chapters, he was writing the late chapters. So I'd say about 2/3 of the book was written while I was doing the translation of the earlier chapters. So I think I have to write a whole book about this translation process because it's so complicated and so hard to describe. Behruz was sending WhatsApp text messages for the book to Munis from the first few months that he was in. He'd been collecting WhatsApp text messages from the beginning. When he met Munis about a year or so after, he started sending all of them to her, and then she started putting them into PDF files. When I accepted the role of translator for the book, and started the translation, to the time that I finished the translation, it was 1 year. But he was writing the book from the very beginning. Behruz wrote the whole book in prose. So there was no poetry, intended poetry in his in the original Farsi. But Farsi sentences are extremely long when it comes to literature, especially. It's very much because it's an Indo-European language. It has a similar structure to, say, German. So you have the subject at the beginning, and the main verb is right at the end of the sentence. And in between, you have all of these consecutive clauses describing different things and going into different directions. But there is this kind of like harmony or melody to the sentence, even though it's very long. And there's this kind of like cogency or consistency in the sentence. But if I translate that into English and keep the same sentence structure, it's completely awkward. It loses all of its rhythm, all of its qualities, and it's very difficult to read. So what I did was I was trying to work out a way to translate these really long sentences, and I started splitting up the sentence into smaller sentences. So the clauses, all of these consecutive clauses, became small sentences. And then that meant I needed to repeat subjects, verbs, adverbs, adjectives, different phrases, so that the different sentences have a kind of relationship with each other. After about the second or third review of the translation, I noticed certain passages sounded like poetry, because of this repetition and the kind of different rhythms that were created as a result of shifting from one language to another. So I was talking to Behruz about it, and we thought, you know what, maybe it's not a bad idea to actually make these passages that sound like poetry and have that kind of poetic quality of the original prose. Why don't we make them poems in English? So we decided that we would transform the Farsi prose into English verse, and that's how it turned out. this is a very confusing aspect of the whole experience of being indefinitely detained on Manus Island. Um, and I think maybe it's important to distinguish between different time periods in this whole situation. So for the first 3.5 years, so from 2013 to 2016, the prison was completely locked down. No one could leave. Even people in different compounds couldn't interact with each other. Everyone was separated inside. So, and also phones were illegal, were banned, completely banned. Behruz and others had maybe like a couple of hours internet access every week. So he smuggled in phones, and that's when he started to write his book and store it through WhatsApp, because he got some of the local guards to smuggle in phones for him. And you're quite correct, he had 2 phones confiscated in really early morning raids by the authorities, and then later on he had 1 phone stolen when he was outside the prison. But I guess he could write this story on WhatsApp and know that it was safe, because when it's in WhatsApp, it's in the kind of WhatsApp domain. And even if he loses his phone, he just has to get another phone and connect to WhatsApp, and he can access those messages again. So during this time, he was writing the phone in secret. He was sending, and then when he met Munis, he would send the text messages out. But after 2016, there was a Supreme Court ruling by the Papua New Guinea Supreme Court, the justice system, that said that this prison is illegal and unconstitutional. And then the Australian authorities couldn't keep the doors locked, and they couldn't stop them from having phones. So at that point, he could leave the prison. Of course, he had nowhere to go, nowhere to access food, nowhere to sleep, no documents to leave the island, but he could at least leave the prison and come back. And it was after this 2016 court ruling, that he didn't have to worry about having his phone taken. And he was able to, through advocates, supporters who would visit the island, he was able to get a better phone as well. So at that point, he could write, and the only worry he had was through intimidation and bullying and other forms of harassment that he would experience. But officially, according to the laws of the prison, he could have a phone after 2016. We were realistic. We knew that all of this wouldn't change the government policy. We were actually involved in this, we were invested in this, because we knew that it's a contribution to history. It's acknowledging all the people who had lost their lives and whose lives have been ruined, and also it's for the next generation. It's a duty to history. So we knew that all of this work wasn't going to change the government. There's other things that need to take place, other kinds of action that would influence government policy. But we were doing this for other reasons. Now, the book has won numerous awards, many awards. It's been translated into many languages and will be translated into more languages. It's started to transform the narrative in Australia. People are starting to see the situation differently, but we have a long way to go. I think to expect that something like this would transform the political situation, the cultural, social situation, the prejudices and the many, many years of kind of a colonial system that exists in Australia still today, it would take more than one book and a few awards. So it's difficult to think about the impact that it's had on Australia, even though there's a new conversation and a lot of people have changed their minds. The last election in May proved that still there is a majority of people who support the government policies regarding refugees. And this is one of the reasons why the book is so powerful and why it's had such an impact on people from all different backgrounds and from all different perspectives. There is an element of, a very strong element of absurdity and paradox and a particular kind of exploration of the subconscious in the book. And it's a reflection of not just the situation of the author. the fact that he has sought protection from a liberal democracy that has signed the UN Convention on for Refugees and has been imprisoned indefinitely. Like this, the absurdity of his situation, the paradoxes that are involved there, relate to his own personal identity, and this then corresponds to the political situation, the border politics, and the way that Australia has developed this particular regime around the border, and how it's influencing other parts of the world, and has these connections with also Australia's colonial past as well. Also in relation to this, there's the mode of production, the way that it was made, the fact that I'm living in different parts of the world, getting these messages from Behruz, collaborating with him over WhatsApp, and he is stuck in this one isolated, remote place. That in itself is also surreal. It's also absurd how it was made. And the content and the techniques and the structure and style of the book also represents that. So there is this kind of mutual reinforcement going on in the book. And so we combine the surrealism with elements of psychological horror and horror realism to make this notion of horrific surrealism, because we didn't want to give it a genre, and we didn't want to like restrict it to one particular kind of style or approach. But talking about it in terms of horrific surrealism opens up many different conversations, and it's more of an attitude, or it's more of a kind of a position. And I should say this is another interesting point, that horrific surrealism relates so much to different examples of Kurdish literature and art in the modern period. So a lot of contemporary, modern and contemporary Kurdish art and literature reflect this horrific surrealist quality. I think for me, as someone who is from Iran but not from a Kurdish background, I had to do so much research into many elements of the book and many kind of frames of reference or symbols that he introduces in the book. And the more I investigated and the more I talked to Behruz about the Kurdish influence of this book, the more I realized that this book is basically deeply rooted in Kurdish folklore, mythology, history, resistance, and also the natural environment from Kurdistan. And I think that you could approach this book in many different ways. You could look at it as an example of Kurdish literature or Kurdish storytelling, and you could look at it as a philosophical text, a political commentary. You could look at it as part of, I guess, a kind of transnational form of literature that brings in Persian classical poetry and literature and Western literature as well. Behruz is very much influenced by Western literature as well, particularly Kafka and Samuel Beckett, and it also brings in a whole range of other forms of writing and other styles. But you could look at it from different perspectives. But the kind of foundation of it comes from his first experiences of storytelling through the kind of community that he grew up in Kurdistan, through his mother, who was the first storyteller that he encountered, through the kind of tales and legends and forms of history that are part of his identity and part of the Kurdish identity in the province that he's from in Iran, called Ilam. So there's so much to be said about that, but for me, the Kurdish element of the book, I think, is structurally, technically, and symbolically fundamental to understanding the book. So first, historically, the invasion of the British Empire to Australia over 200 years ago was basically for the establishment of an offshore prison. Australia, essentially, as a nation, as what we understand as Australia as a nation today, was basically stolen from Indigenous peoples and made into an offshore prison. So its very origins are connected with incarceration and also warehousing people or exiling people, getting rid of people, dumping people in another place, away from the kind of the center of empire. So there's this, there is this element, and Australia was a place that had over 500 nations in it before colonisation, and these people, the Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islander peoples, ended up being moved from their traditional homelands to other places, and in a lot of cases they were taken to islands and taken from, put into cattle stations or into missions and other forms of incarceration, you could say, because even though they were forced into roles, into working, and often denied payment or paid very little. So there was this system of kind of like transient mobile prisons being designed in Australia from a very early period, sometimes on islands offshore, sometimes within the mainland. But this became a characteristic of Australia as a nation, and even I think it would be interesting for Italian readers to know that during the Second World War, Italian migrants were put into the same kinds or similar kinds of detention centres because of the kind of political imaginary at the time, and this kind of threat of fascism and the paranoia. Of course, so much of it fabricated, but innocent people, innocent Italian migrants, lots of them born in Australia, were put into detention centres without trial, without committing a crime. So there's this kind of historical dimension to what's happening on Manus Island. It's part of Australia's collective identity. And it begins with the dispossession and oppression of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The other one is, the other explanation is in terms of the political system. Australia is doing this to innocent people, breaking international law, essentially, as a way to deter people from coming to Australia to seek protection. Let's make the situation so bad that no one will want to come to Australia and exercise their human right in terms of asking for protection. So there's this element, and it's really interesting in terms of sovereignty. Australia is asserting itself in terms of who it allows in and how they come to the country. It's an important point that this only happens to people who come by boat. Since 2013, only people who come by boat have been sent to Manus Island and Nauru. Majority of people who come and seek asylum in Australia come by plane, but the media doesn't demonise them in the same way. The government doesn't criminalise them in the same way. This is very clearly a political strategy. One, it's about Australia's political identity. It's about their understanding of sovereignty. And two, it's about winning elections as well. Demonizing people in this way, a very small number of people in this way, creating these lies about people coming by boat, traveling illegally or entering illegally. All of these myths that are created are used in strategic ways when it comes to elections.